I am joined today by Nidal, who is a PhD candidate in the Department of Learning and Leadership in the Institute of Education at University College London in the UK. Welcome, Nidal.
Hi, thank you for the opportunity. I'm pleased to speak to you today about my research.
We're very pleased to have you here. Could you briefly describe your PhD project for us?
Yeah, well, my research explores leading international schools, mainly learning-centered practice of school leaders, and it focuses on leadership development across the organization. And it also explores how leaders respond to and interact with the social capital of teachers and students. And the reason why I'm focusing also on social capital is it stems basically from two reasons. One is the diversity, the unique and diverse environments in each of these schools. And the second, it's based on my theoretical framework because I'm using Pierre Bourdieu's social theory. And that's why I'm constantly aware of the social elements and social aspects of working in these schools as I'm working on my research.
In your project, you have included the impact that the pandemic has had on teachers and students. Would you tell us more about this decision?
Right. Well, initially, my design obviously was not focused on the pandemic because it was prepared before the outbreak of COVID-19. However, as I was preparing to start my data collection and due to increasing restrictions back in February and March 2020, and then the lockdown in both Qatar and England where I'm conducting my research, so I decided to change and move my data collection process to the virtual space instead of site visits. And I was contacting schools for a few months before I planned to start conducting my data collection. And over that time, by spring and summer last year, I found out that schools were really, really overwhelmed. There were so many changes taking place. Many of them were moving to new platforms for teaching and learning, some in hybrid zones, hybrid modes, or just completely online. And there were changing directives and changing instruction by governments and local authorities. There were high concerns about safety and health risks. So I could not just ignore that and proceed with my pre-prepared questions. I decided to capture this unprecedented time and unprecedented challenge that's faced by school leaders and teachers and high school students. And I added questions on the influence of the pandemic to each through different research tools, because I'm not only doing interviews, I'm doing also a comprehensive survey, I'm doing field analysis, but the interviews are the main method of my case studies. So I added questions on how the pandemic has influenced the practice of leaders and the priorities of the work, how it influenced teachers and the interaction with students. And I also added that element to my interviews with high school students. So how did the pandemic shape the learning experience?
In addition to the questions, so to the new questions that you added, was there an impact on the number of schools that you included in your case studies? Did the group get larger or smaller, or how did that work out?
Yeah, well, thank you very much. That's an interesting question. It actually impacted. Initially, the plan was to conduct work with 6 case studies, 3 schools from England and 3 schools from Qatar, and 60 surveys that were supposed to be filled by principals. However, it was actually very difficult to proceed completely, and I secured because I had a certain plan. I had a time frame for my data collection. It was supposed to start September 1 and end before that Christmas holiday. I had to extend until about January 12th, but I only secured 5 case studies out of 6 and 50 responses from principals for my questionnaire instead of 60, which was the initial target. But I believe that was meaningful enough, and I have really a large size of data that is very, very meaningful and very powerful.
I imagine so. I was just curious to hear if there was an impact on the size in addition to the questions and having to be flexible given the new circumstances that the pandemic brought about. Could you tell us about some of the findings from your interviews, perhaps challenges that leaders faced or teachers and students, have faced during the pandemic and how they have actually had an impact on how they've actually influenced the social impact of leadership?
Yeah, I'm going to share three key findings from my interviews so far. So at three different levels: one at the leadership level, at the teaching and curriculum level, and third on students level. So for leadership, I found out that there was a changing hierarchy of priorities. There were also changing strategies and the decision-making process has been taking place differently. So the pre-pandemic order of things has been disrupted, and now leaders have been referring to new modes of practice. And one of these things is that usually in most of the schools and most of the principals that I've interviewed, they explained that they used to take decisions based on a certain protocol, which starts with a certain different meetings, consulting specific people and the leadership team and many other procedures. However, in what they refer to as leading in emergencies or leading in crises, what happens is that in many cases, the head of school needed to make a decision sometimes in a few hours or less, and that had to be passed quickly to the school community. And there were many changing decisions. So one decision that is valid today might not be valid tomorrow. And therefore, they needed to take different measures and approach the decision-making process differently. And another aspect that appeared in my interviews and through my work with schools is that the emerging of a new form of leadership, and there were new people now leading the process of change and the process of coping with the pandemic, which wasn't there before, or at least was very limited before. So now I found out that professional teams such as IT teams, health and well-being, counselors, cleaning staff, and the logistics teams taking place in schools, these have been now taking leadership and they're contributing, and their input to the decision-making process has been really immense and highly appreciated. This is changing because that wasn't a part of my pilot study. For example, before the pilot study I conducted about a year and a half, it was completely different. The decision-making process and the order of priorities for leadership was completely different. And now this change has been brought up by the pandemic.
As far as the new forms of leadership that have emerged as a result of the pandemic, and you mentioned that some decisions that had to be taken within sometimes a matter of hours, do you believe, or does the data that you've collected seem to indicate that these decision-making processes are becoming more streamlined? If people have to respond very quickly in some cases, that there's less input perhaps from all of the stakeholders and all of the actors because critical decisions need to be made as a result of these unusual circumstances? And is that then separate from the normal, so to speak, or the traditional models of decision-making and leadership?
Well, I think that's the case. That's what I've noticed, what I found out, that what my data reflected. And we cannot judge yet the impact or the implications of this change because it was taking place during an emergency situation. So no one has been really trained to lead in a crisis like this. No one has been anticipating. So all of these strategic plans and development plans for schools have been now altered or sometimes squeezed or just put aside because they wanted to cope with a new situation. I don't believe the same style of leadership would still be persistent after when things go back to whatever new normal there would be. However, there has been a change, and that change will not be allowing the new normal to be completely as it was. So I do believe it's a process of change that has already been in place. People are getting used to it. As long as the pandemic is getting longer and longer, people are coping with this new change. And there will be a lot of implications, I believe, but it's hard to judge at the moment.
Mm-hmm. It sounds like it. So that actually leads me to another question, or it segues nicely into my last question, namely what the future holds in stores. So you have just indicated that you believe that some of the changes that have been made as a result of the pandemic will likely stick around then once a new normal has set in, hopefully once the pandemic is fully under control. what do you have as, can you perhaps specify a little bit more concretely what some of these developments or changes may look like? Or do you believe that the changes that occurred within the course of the pandemic will become stronger and intensify?
Yeah, thank you. I think this is a very important question, because as we're now looking at the moment, we need to analyze and anticipate what might be the new normal after this pandemic. But maybe before I just give a spotlight on what the implications might be, I would like just to share with you two main findings from my data collection regarding teachers and students. So for teachers and curriculum leaders, there has been overwhelming change over the last few months, or over the last probably year, because the learning time for them has been disrupted. So no school, I believe no school has been really conducting or giving its students the same learning time. So they were trying to modify and adapt the curriculum, and mainly because I've worked with high school students and high school teachers, their work has been immensely pressured. So they're still working to prepare the students to high stakes assessment and to competitive university admissions, but at the same time working online, fully online, or in hybrid modes, or sometimes teaching at the same time on Zoom and in the classrooms for two different groups of students. So they are still working while being concerned for their own physical health, well-being, and about the family's safety. And also there has been some equity issues, equity concerns for teachers, economic changes, probably job security, a lot of changes related to the work. So that has been placing teachers under a lot of pressure. And I believe this needs to be addressed carefully by the leaders in the sector. And the other fact that has been really hard is into my high school students' interviews. I've interviewed groups of high school students, and all of them shared that data has been really consistent across Qatar and England, and different sizes and types of schools. So students have been sharing with me that they're working in isolation. They miss their friends, they miss their sports and physical activities, they miss life, they miss, and many of them from international backgrounds, they miss traveling to their countries and seeing their loved ones. So it has been a very difficult year, but at the same time, students are still working towards a very highly competitive system, and trying to meet the high expectations and the university admissions criteria. So it has been, I think everything has changed, but the competitive system is still in place. And I think this also needs to be addressed. So having said this about teachers and students at struggle, I would call it struggle. I think something needs to be changed in terms of the wider picture. In terms, someone needs to need to focus on the bigger picture, probably. So I believe school leaders are capable of doing that. School leaders and teachers and curriculum leaders. There are so many brilliant people out there in schools, and they're capable of rethinking and replanning how they're leading schools, how they're teaching, and how they're really shaping student learning. However, this needs to be supported by decisions at the policy and system level. It doesn't really help to be decentralized, because it didn't work. Over the past year, we've seen that the system has been really failing, or at least not coping properly. So the schooling system has been more focused on competitiveness and accomplishments in terms of finances and professional excellence rates and accreditation scores and all of that. And I believe we need to rethink how we can more focus on the quality and depth of learning and the process of learning, rather than the accomplishments and the quantity and the outcomes, test scores or attainment rates. And because I don't believe that it's going to be serving us anymore. What used to happen over the past decades in the international school sector has been like those leaders and teachers have been educated and trained to teach and focus on the teaching and learning process, on pedagogy, on the quality of learning. However, they've been told by the industry that these are not the rules of the game, and you need to cope with a more competitive business and corporate lifestyle. And I don't think the focus of schools has been really on society, on developing a community and developing learners in the sense of really being social human beings and compassionate towards the environment and the planet in which we live. So the focus was more on competitiveness. And I think if probably one highlight is going to come out of my research is what's the purpose of these schools and what's the role and purpose of leading schools. So I believe leading schools should be taking into consideration how the change of the order of priorities will be for delivering leading and teaching practice in schools towards a more equitable and more compassionate world that takes into consideration society in general, not just economy, because it's obviously appear that it's not serving us properly.
That's a really interesting point that you bring up, the benchmarking aspect of schools and how teachers for many decades now have been ever increasingly taught to teach in a certain direction, to achieve certain accomplishments, certain scores, certain standardized testing, or certain standardized tests. So do you believe that the pandemic, as unfortunate as it may have been, revealed or perhaps represents an opportunity to reshape the educational system and leadership styles in schools, and perhaps reframe what's taught and how education is delivered to students?
Absolutely. I think there are many opportunities that have been evident over the last year that we need to really rethink and replan, and the change that has already taken place is already a foundation for a continuation of this change. So we are in the middle of this, and the change probably was not anticipated and we were not ready for it. However, because it happened and we had to take some serious changes to cope with it, it's a golden opportunity now to really build on that and continue to rethink and replan of how we want our schools to look like, or what we want our schools to focus on.
Perhaps one last question. In reference to the teachers, you had mentioned the topic of equity. Did your case studies also look at equity with regard to students? One issue that comes to mind for me, perhaps, is certain areas that may be weaker in terms of infrastructure, so that if you have these hybrid modes of learning, if students are at home and they're trying to learn via Zoom or via some other online platform, but they have slow internet, or multiple people are trying to use a single device to either work or engage in education of some sort. Has that been a topic or an issue that has come up in your research at all?
It was. Well, my research worked with international schools, or my data collection was in international schools, and these schools are known to be not the most underprivileged. However, many of these students are the companies where their parents work pay for their fees, and that has been there has been an aspect of threat or the lack of job security for these families. So many of the students have shared with me that they're not sure if they'll continue to be in this school next year, or if they're going to keep their university choices for the following year because a parent or both parents have been, have lost a job, or they've been informed that the contract will be terminated. So that has influenced the overall status of the student. There's no sense of security anymore. And many of them have been sharing that they will be going back to their countries because the contract of the family or the parent will not be renewed at a certain point. So there has been an element of pressure. And also some of them mentioned that they feel very, for example, embarrassed to put the camera on because when they attend their Zoom classes, because they have siblings in the same room, or they have parents working from home also. And so it has been difficult for many of them, and I think no school I've interacted with has shown really any offer to support with devices, or I don't think that was an element that's been on the table. Two of the schools have been already providing the students with a tablet for each student. But the rest of the schools didn't, and some of the students have been struggling with having an available tablet for them to do the work, available laptop to do the work. So yeah, the digital accessibility definitely has been an issue during this time.
Great. Thank you very much for that. That was a very interesting insight into your work, into your research, into some of the initial findings that you've collected from your data. And I look forward to reading more and learning more in the future.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you.